Let's begin with a bit of background, including some history, starting with SAML, the Security Assertion Markup Language. It's a standard developed by Oasis. SAML exchanges are expressed in an XML formatted payload for those assertions and responses using HTTP as the communication protocol. It's been around for a while, last updated by Oasis in 2008. Next, we have APIs, those application programming interfaces. The REST APIs were made really popular, starting with Roy Fielding's dissertation. And I'll show you all the power that you can have with APIs coming up, and how they can be used with IDaaS, that identity as a service, that is. Now, there are several IDaaS solutions made available on the market. I'll be demonstrating the Oracle Identity Cloud Service, or also known as IDCS. Again, one of several identity as a service solutions made available, in this case in the Oracle Public Cloud. Also, for more information in the blog, I have references for the various websites I'm showing. Now with Oracle IDCS, they offer several REST APIs, including support for SCIM, those compliant endpoints that do a wide range of functions, including managing users and groups. Now while in this demonstration I'll be showing how the REST APIs can build a federated partnership for SAML, just know that it also supports SCIM. First, to start building, we'll need the metadata from the identity provider, or IDP, which contains important details for setting up the federation partnership. To obtain IDP metadata, we can grab that metadata from a publicly available URL. And that's what I'm showing here in this method too, making that metadata URL publicly available in Oracle IDCS. Alright, so here we have the IDP metadata shown here in XML format. It's going to include many important details, including the entity ID, that unique attribute for the identity provider. Additionally, other information like the signing and encryption certificates needed to set up federated partnership. Very well, now that I have the IDP metadata, let's configure AWS as a service provider. In the AWS admin console, I'm going to be using the IAM Identity Center for that service provider setup. Quick note here, this does require that you have an AWS organization setup. Now I'm going to first go to Settings here. In the Settings screen, I'm going to select Actions and then change the identity source. Next, I'm going to have some options for changing my identity source. And in this case, I can choose Identity Center Directory, Active Directory. And in this case, I'm going to actually choose the external identity provider and select Next. Now, just like the identity provider has metadata, so does the service provider. It also has metadata. So under the service provider metadata, I'll select Download Metadata File so I can use those details later in the step when I'm setting up the IDP. Things like the sign-in URL, the assertion consumer service or ACS URL, where I'll show you later that SAML-based XML is posted there via HTTP. Remember, metadata in this context, it describes how a SAML entity is configured. Next up, under the identity provider metadata, I'm going to upload that metadata that I had from our Oracle IDCS or IDaaS solution. That's that IDCS metadata.xml file that I downloaded earlier. And I'm going to simply upload that and select Next. Again, I'm using an external identity provider using the IDCS IDP metadata, and then I need to review and confirm the change. Scrolling down to the bottom of the page, I'm going to type accept and then change the identity source. And then after a moment of processing, I'm going to be sent back to the settings page. Now, AWS does have this idea of automatically provisioning from your IDP or identity provider. And while we're not going to do that here, just something you should know about as we proceed with user accounts. Now, in many cases, user creation or provisioning of user accounts will be handled with automatic processing. In this case, I've manually created a user account for demonstrating access to AWS. To configure the IDP, I'll shift to Postman, my utility to help me execute the API, in this case, create a SAML application. This API will use the HTTP post method with environment variables in Postman that I set up previously. Also, this API does require authentication and authorization with a properly formatted body so I can set up the IDP. So some key features in the body include the display name, which I'm setting as AWS IDaaS blog, and then I'm going to set the description as AWS IDaaS blog example, followed by the login mechanism in this case, which is SAML. And then from the AWS SP metadata, I've entered the partner provider ID. That's also known as the entity ID. And then we have the assertion consumer service or ACS URL, and that's where the SAML assertion is posted during the authentication process. And another important detail is this name ID format, and that's the associated name ID coming from the IDP. It's typically the subject or the user that's being authenticated. In this case, we're using email address. Now that I have this set up, I'll simply execute the HTTP post by selecting send, and after that API is executed, I'll receive a response from IDCS, my IDaaS solution, like this example here. Now within the response, I'll scroll down and I want to grab the value of outbound assertion attributes, that identifier, and with that I can actually create an attribute profile with another API call. All right, so I'm going to copy the outbound assertion attributes value here so I can use that in my next step in a moment. So using Postman, I can execute an HTTP put request to build an attribute profile. The purpose of an attribute profile is to generate the SAML assertion during authentication. So I simply add the value I copied for outbound assertion attributes identifier to this put request, and I'm going to show you the body that we're going to be sending in for this purpose. In the body, I'm defining the attributes for the attribute profile, including given name, otherwise known as first name, SN, otherwise known as surname or last name, mail, otherwise known as email address, and the most important attribute is this username. That ties it back to the username that I created manually in AWS. That's the key attribute that's required for AWS to work with my external provider. Selecting send will execute the API put method over HTTP to IDCS. Now let me show you the result in the IDCS console. First the name and description, and then under the SSO configuration, notice that we have the entity ID that we set, assertion consumer service URL, that ACS URL is next here, followed by, of course, the name ID itself as the format was email address, and then of course the name ID value, which is email address as well. Under the attribute profile configuration, we've identified those attributes. First of all, given name for first name, surname for last name, an email address or mail, that is, and then last but not least, the most important, username. Now, each of them corresponds to an attribute set of first name, last name, email address, and of course, username. In this case, we're using email address for that. Since we now have both the SP and the IDP set up, we can now test this out. In AWS, I'll copy out the AWS Access portal, and then in another browser, I can trace this activity. To trace the actions, I can use Firefox with an add-on called SAML Tracer. Notice when I browse to the AWS Access portal, it briefly hits AWS, sees no authentication, and redirects me to my IDaaS login page. This is where I enter my username and my password. After my username and password are validated, the IDCS identity provider then redirects and posts my SAML assertion back to the AWS service provider. Granted, there's not much to see here, but let's take a closer look at the SAML trace. Notice the orange SAML icon in the trace. It's here that I can look for the SAML assertion. Then by selecting the SAML tab in the trace, I can view the SAML assertion in XML format. Now if I quickly scroll to the bottom of that XML, and I can show you the key attribute, that username attribute, you'll notice that the name of a username has an attribute value of my email address. I'll show you in a second here. So again, username, and it's associated with my email address in this case. That's dazzling. That's how SAML works from start to finish using IDaaS with the efficiency of APIs.